Elias Marsh sat on an upturned bucket at the ladder D corral, drawing the branding fire in a book held together with saddle string. The morning was already hot. The iron glowed in the coals. A calf bawled, and a rope sang, and the smell of scorched hair rolled across the yard. Elias did not flinch at any of it. His hand moved. The pencil moved. On the page, the fire took shape the way it took shape in the world, orange going white at the heart of it. Boyd Hatch kicked dust across the page and called him the laziest man in Wyoming Territory. Elias did not look up. He kept drawing. That was the first thing about him you had to understand. He kept drawing. Boyd stood over him a moment longer, waiting for a rise that never came. Then he spat and walked off toward the chute, because there was real work to do, and in Boyd's mind a man with a pencil was not doing it. The other hands laughed the small laugh men laugh when the foreman makes a joke. Elias turned the page. Come supper that night, Boyd was not done. He took the sketchbook right off the bench where Elias had set it. He held it up over the horse trough in front of 20 hands, dangling it by one cover the way you dangle a kitten you meant to drown. The saddle string binding stretched. A grown man playing with a pencil while men work, Boyd said. You don't earn a bunk here, you decorate it. And up on the porch, in a cane chair with a cigar, Cyrus Dunmore laughed. The cattle baron laughed, and when the baron laughed, the whole yard had permission. Now hold that picture. The little book swinging over the water. The men laughing. The rich man on the porch. Because at that same hour, miles off, a stagecoach was cresting the long rise east of town. Inside it sat a stranger in an eastern coat, a coat too good for that country, and across his knees lay a magazine. On the cover of that magazine, stamped small in the corner, was a mark, a running horse. A little galloping horse, no bigger than a thumbnail. The same running horse Elias Marsh drew in the corner of every single page he ever finished. Nobody in that ranch yard knew the stranger was coming. Nobody connected the swinging book to the coach on the hill. That is the whole story, and you are about to watch it happen from both ends at once. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who should have looked closer, this story is for you. If it's landing, do me one favor. Subscribe, and in the comments tell me what city you're watching from. I read them. I want to know where in the world this story found you tonight. Now let's go back to Cordell Flats, and let's take it slow, because the slow part is where it gets good. Cordell Flats, Wyoming Territory, the summer of 1884. Dry high plains, the grass gone the color of a lion's hide, a sky so wide it made men small and most of them never noticed. There was a main street of packed dirt, a general store, a livery, a saloon, a church that doubled as a schoolroom, and past the last fence, the ladder D Cyrus Dunmore's brand. Cyrus Dunmore's cattle. Cyrus Dunmore's word, which in that county was close enough to law. Elias Marsh had drifted in 2 years back. Nobody remembered the exact day. That was the kind of man he was. He came up the road with a bedroll and a canvas sack, asked at the ladder D for work, and took what was offered, which was not much. A loft bunk over the livery on the ranch's edge, beans and bacon at the long table, a few dollars a month for handwork, mending fence, hauling water, whatever a man with 2 good hands and no complaints could be pointed at. He spoke maybe 10 words a day. I mean that. You could stand next to Elias Marsh from sunup to noon and hear nothing but his breathing. It wasn't rudeness. It wasn't pride. He simply had nothing he needed to say, and he'd made his peace with the silence a long time before he ever came to Wyoming. But every spare minute, and the man found more spare minutes than the foreman liked, he drew. He drew the herd bunched against a coming storm. He drew the branding smoke going up in a slow blue rope. He drew a young hand asleep against a wagon wheel with his hat over his face and his boots crossed. He drew the cook's hands breaking eggs. He drew the church steeple at dusk with a bat cutting across it. He drew all of it, in a sketchbook bound with saddle string, and when one book filled up he started another, and where the old ones went. Nobody asked. The men thought him idle. Of course they did. They saw a man sitting when he could be standing, looking when he could be roping, and to them that was the same as sleeping on your feet. Idle, soft, simple, maybe, a little touched. But you, I want you to look closer than they did. That's the whole invitation of this story. Look closer, because the ranch dismissed Elias Marsh completely, and I want you to feel how completely. At the long supper table he was last to be served, always, and by the time the platter reached his end of the bench, the good cuts were gone, and the biscuits were the hard ones. When something went wrong in the yard, a gate left open, a bucket knocked over, a horse got loose. The first name out of Boyd's mouth was Marsh, whether Marsh had been near it or not. And twice that spring, Cyrus Dunmore had docked his wages, not for laziness they could prove, for daydreaming. That was the word written in Dunmore's own ledger, in Dunmore's own hand. Docked, Marsh, daydreaming, as if a man's looking were a theft. Elias took the dockings the way he took everything. He nodded. He went back to work. That night, he drew the ledger book itself, closed, on the corner of Dunmore's desk, with the lamp beside it, and he never showed a soul. Here is a thing I have to tell you now. Quiet, the way you'd tell it to one person, and not a room. Because it matters more than anything else in this story, and almost nobody in Cordell Flats ever gave it a second thought. Elias Marsh never signed his name to a single drawing. Not once. Not his initials in full. Not Elias, not Marsh, nothing a man could read. In the corner of every finished page, small enough that you'd miss it if you weren't looking, he put a mark instead. A little running horse. Legs stretched out front and back, mane flying, the whole animal caught mid-stride in about 6 strokes of the pencil. That was his signature. That was all of it. A habit, folks would have said, if any of them had bothered to notice. Just a habit. The man draws a little horse in the corner. Nobody thought twice. You remember the magazine on the stranger's knee. You remember the mark stamped on its cover. The whole country knew that running horse. The ranch had simply never looked. Now, there was one person in Cordell Flats who looked at Elias Marsh and saw a person, and I want you to hold on to her, because she's the warm thread through this cold cloth. Her name was Cora Bell. She kept the counter at the general store. A widow, gray coming in early, a apron always dusted with flour or lamp black or whatever she'd been handling. She had a way of talking to a man that didn't need much back from him, which suited Elias fine. He came in for pencils. That was the thing he could never make himself go without, though he'd go without near everything else. Good pencils, the kind that came boxed from back east and cost more than a hungry man had any business spending. And paper. He bought paper the way another man bought whiskey, steady and a little ashamed. The morning I'm thinking of, he came in and set 2 bits on the counter, which was not enough, and he knew it wasn't, and Cora knew it, and she slid a fresh pencil across the wood anyway and said she'd put the rest on his account. His account was a long column in her book, and it never seemed to get any shorter, and she never seemed to mind. "Trade you," she said. She always said trade you. He'd leave a little drawing every so often, on a scrap, and she'd take it like it squared the debt, which it did not by the numbers, but the numbers were never the point with Cora Bell. And here is what I need you to see in that store. The thing hanging on the wall behind her counter, up above the crackers and the tins. It was one of his. A finished plate, a real one, pinned to the boards. A picture of a Wyoming rider coming down out of high country with a storm at his back and the light doing something on the ridgeline you don't have words for. It had been printed once, on good paper, though Cora didn't fully understand where or how. What she understood was this. A traveling drummer had come through the winter before, a man who sold notions off a wagon, and he'd seen that plate on her wall and stopped cold. Stood there, with his hat in his hand. And he'd offered her $1 for it, a whole silver dollar. For a picture, off a store wall in a town nobody could find. Cora had said no. She couldn't bear to sell it, she told him. Didn't rightly know why, and the drummer had shaken his head and paid his $1 for his tobacco and left, and the plate stayed pinned to the wall, and Cora went on not knowing exactly what she had. But you know what it means that a stranger off a wagon offered real coin for a picture drawn by the man the whole ranch called simple. Weigh that $1. Nobody in that town weighed it. You do. Elias took his pencil, and he looked up at the pinned plate for a second, the way a man glances at something he made a long time ago, and then he touched his hat to Cora Bell and walked back out into the heat. And that was the most tenderness anybody showed anybody in Cordell Flats that whole day. The mockery, though, the mockery didn't rest. It never rests, with men like Boyd Hatch, because a quiet man is a kind of itch to a loud one. A few nights on, in the bunkhouse, Boyd found the sketchbook again. Elias had made the mistake of leaving it on his blanket while he went to wash. Boyd picked it up, and instead of just tossing it, he made an evening of it. He passed it around the bunkhouse, hand to hand, down the row of cots, and each man was to give his critique, like a bunch of tobacco-chewing gallery men in New York City. This one, a hand named Pettis, said, holding up a drawing of the remuda at dawn, "This one's missing something, missing a saddle on that horse," another said, and they roared. "Look here," Boyd said, "this is supposed to be the cook, and he don't even have the man's ears right," and they roared again, though the drawing had the cook so exactly that a blind man could have found him by it. And somewhere in the passing, a corner tore. Just a corner. A little triangle of a page come loose in somebody's rough fingers and fluttered down onto the plank floor. Elias came back in from washing, water still on his forearms. He crossed the room. He didn't hurry, and he didn't slow. He held out his hand, and Boyd, grinning, set the book in it. Elias bent and picked the torn corner up off the floor and fit it back where it went, matching the edge. And he closed the book and put it under his arm and lay down on his bunk with his back to them all. He said nothing. Not one word. And that, right there, is the trap the whole ranch fell into. Because his silence, to them, read as slowness. A sharp man defends himself. A proud man swings. Elias did neither, and so they filed him away as simple, and every day the filing got easier, and the contempt got heavier, and none of them ever once considered the other possibility. That a man might not answer because your opinion of him did not weigh a feather against the thing he already knew about himself. The blind spot was the whole ranch's, but it started at the top, and it ran downhill. Now the cattle came due for sale, and buyers came through, the way they did every season. Men in town suits with hard eyes who walked the pens and figured weight and made offers over the porch rail. Dunmore loved that week. It was the week the world came to him, hat in hand, wanting what he had. He'd stand on that porch and hold court. One of the buyers that year was a heavy-set man up from the railheads, and after the figuring was done and the coffee was poured, he wandered. Buyers do. He drifted down toward the corral where Elias sat, because Elias was always sitting somewhere with that book, and the buyer looked over his shoulder the way a man will, idle, and then he stopped being idle. He looked at the page a good while. Then he pointed at the corner. At the little running horse. "I know that mark," he said. Slow, like it was coming up from somewhere deep. "I've seen that mark. Back east. On something. In a book or he snapped his fingers, trying to catch it. A magazine. That's it. That little horse. It's on And Cyrus Dunmore, up on the porch, called out that the coffee was getting cold, and were they going to talk cattle or admire the help's scribbles, and he laughed. And the men on the porch laughed, and the buyer, being a guest, laughed too. And let it go. He let it go. He turned around and went back up to the porch, and the coffee and the numbers, and the thing he'd almost caught slipped back down into the deep, and the moment died, right there in the dust. I don't know how to tell you how close that was without shouting, so I'll just say it plain. A man stood one sentence away from the truth. One sentence. And the loudest man in the county talked right over it, because the loudest man could not conceive that anything worth knowing might be found down at the corral, in the hands of the drifter, in a book bound with string. Dunmore's whole life had taught him that value wears a suit and comes up the porch steps. Value does not sit on a bucket. And so the truth walked right past him and tipped its hat, and he never felt the wind of it. You felt it. I know you did. The season turned toward its end, and with the end came the big supper. The whole outfit at the long tables in the yard, lanterns strung, a beef killed for it. The one night of the year Dunmore let the liquor flow a little and played the generous king. 20 hands and more. Everybody who worked that ranch was there, and everybody who worked that ranch was watching, when Boyd Hatch decided to make Elias Marsh the entertainment. He'd been drinking, which loosened the cruelty in him. He got up from the bench and he had the sketchbook, and I never did learn how he came to have it that night, whether he took it from the loft or Elias had it with him, but he had it, and he walked down the yard with it held up over his head so all could see. "Boys," he said. "Boys, our artist. Our great artist." And they turned on the benches, all those faces orange in the lantern light, all those grins. There was a horse trough at the end of the yard, long and full, the water black in the dark. Boyd walked to it. He held the sketchbook out over the middle of it, 2 years of some man's looking, dangling by one cover over the black water, and he looked back up the tables at Cyrus Dunmore, because a dog always checks the master's face. And Dunmore gave it to him. Dunmore leaned back in his chair with his cigar, and he said, loud, so the whole yard got it. "A man who decorates instead of works," he said, "can find somewhere else to decorate come autumn. This is a cattle ranch, Marsh, not a—" He waved the cigar, searching for the word, and settled on it like a slap. "A parlor. Notice. Notice he said it to the whole yard and not to Elias. Notice he never once, in 2 years, spoke to the man like a man." Elias stood up. He didn't rush. He came down off the bench, and he walked the length of the tables, slow, in that quiet of his, and every eye tracked him. He stopped a few feet from Boyd and the trough. He didn't reach. He didn't beg. He just stood there and looked at Boyd Hatch with those still eyes, and for 1 second, something crossed Boyd's face that might have been doubt. Then Boyd let go. The book fell. 2 years fell, tumbling, pages fanning open in the lantern light, the running horse flashing by in a dozen corners at once, down toward the black water, and Elias caught it. One hand, an inch above the surface, so close that a drop of water jumped up and darkened the bottom edge of the paper and no more. He caught it clean, and he brought it up against his chest, and he held it there. The yard exploded. 20 men laughing at the drifter scrambling for his silly book, laughing at Boyd's fine joke, laughing at the great artist who'd near lost his masterpiece to a horse trough. Dunmore laughed hardest of all, up on his porch, the king delighted with his fool. Elias Marsh turned around, with the book against his chest, and one dark drop drying on the corner of a page, and he walked back up the yard and out past the lantern light and into the dark toward the livery loft. And he did not once look back. And he did not once say a word. And that was the loudest anyone in Cordell Flats ever laughed at him. And it was the last time. They just didn't know yet that it was the last time. But you do. So now he was fired. Not this minute, but come autumn, which was near enough. Given his notice in front of the whole world, told he could decorate somewhere else. And here is the part that ought to break something loose in you, because it's the truest thing about the man. He kept drawing. The very next morning he was back on his bucket. He drew the branding that went on right up to the end of the season, the last of it, the iron and the smoke and the dust. He drew a storm that came up green-black over the western ridge one afternoon and hung there throwing light like the end of the world. And he drew it fast, before it broke. And it's a wonder to look at. He drew Cora Belle at her counter, from memory, the flower on her apron, and the pins in her hair. A man with a month's notice on his back, drawing like he had all the time God ever made. Because, and this is the thing the ranch never grasped, Elias Marsh had not spent 2 years recording the latter D. He didn't care about the latter D. He was recording the West, the whole of it, the light and the labor and the loneliness of it, the way it truly was, and not the way the dime novels lied about it. He'd been doing it for 2 years for an audience that had never smelled a branding fire and never would. An audience of hundreds of thousands, back east, in parlors and rail cars and barbershops, who opened a certain magazine each month and turned to a certain kind of picture and did not know the name of the man who made them, because the man had never given them one. Only a little running horse in the corner. The ranch thought they were firing a drifter. They were about to fire the most looked-at pair of hands in the territory, and they had no idea. And the thing that was going to teach them was already off the stage and walking up the main street of Cordell Flats. Because the stranger had arrived, the Eastern coach had come in the evening before the supper, actually, and set its one passenger down in front of the livery in a cloud of dust, and he'd stood there a moment in his good coat, looking at the raw little town like a man who'd come a very long way on a hunch. Nathaniel Crane, editor of Haringate's Illustrated Weekly out of New York. And if you'd told the men at the latter D that a New York editor was standing in their town, they'd have laughed at that too. Because what would such a man want here? What he wanted was a ghost. For 2 years, plates had come to Crane's magazine by mail. Frontier scenes, drawn from life, drawn by somebody who was clearly out here in it, because you could not fake that light. You could not fake the exact way a rope lays in the dirt or the exact slump of a tired man in the saddle. The plates were signed with nothing but a little running horse and initialed, when they were initialed at all, with 2 small letters, H, M, and Crane had printed them, and his circulation had climbed, and climbed, because readers back east were starving for the real West, and here at last was a hand that gave it to them true. Crane had written to the post box the plates came from. Cordell Flats, Wyoming Territory. He'd sent letters. And money, always money. And the letters were answered rarely and briefly, and the money was cashed slow, and never once had the artist come east. Never once asked for more. Never once traded on the fame that was quietly building around a mark shaped like a horse. Which drove Nathaniel Crane half to distraction, because in his world fame was the whole point. Fame announced itself. Fame took the train to New York and demanded a better rate. His star did none of that. His star was a hole in the map that mailed him genius and asked for nothing. So at last, circulation being what it was, and curiosity being what it was, Crane had gotten on a train and then a coach and come to find him. He'd start, he decided, at the one place in any small town that knows every soul who passes through. The general store. He came into Cora Belle's the morning after the supper, while the ranch was still nursing its heads and Elias was already up on his bucket drawing the light. Crane came in out of the glare blinking, this soft-handed man in his fine coat, and he asked Cora if she might know the local hands, the men who worked the ranch's roundabout, because he was looking for a particular one, an artist, though he didn't rightly know his name. And then, mid-sentence, Nathaniel Crane stopped talking. Because he had seen the wall behind her counter, he had seen the plate pinned above the crackers and the tins. I have to tell you what happened in that man's face, because it's the hinge the whole story turns on. He went pale, and then he went forward, right up to the counter, close as the wood would let him, and he stared at that pinned picture the way you'd stare at a face you'd loved and buried, and his mouth came open, and no sound came out for a moment, and Cora Belle drew back a little, not knowing what she'd done. That plate, Crane finally said. His voice had gone strange, That plate on your wall. Where? How did you come to have that? Cora said a man drew it, a local man. She said a drummer once offered her $1 for it and she'd said no. $1? Crane repeated, and something between a laugh and a sob got loose in him, because he knew exactly what that plate was. He had printed its brothers. His own back issues were built on that line, that light, that hand. He'd have paid her $100 for it and thought he'd robbed her. $1. Who drew this? He said. He put both hands flat on her counter to steady himself. Who drew this, and where is he? Tell me where he is. And Cora Bell, careful, because she was always careful with Elias, and because a fine coat in a poor town can mean help or harm and you can't always tell which, looked at this trembling stranger a long moment. Then she made up her mind. She wiped her hands on her apron. The ladder D, she said. Cyrus Dunmore's place, out past the last fence. Ask for Marsh. Elias Marsh. Though, she added, and her mouth tightened, though I'll thank you not to make trouble for him. He's had enough of that from men better dressed than you. Crane hardly heard the warning. He was already reaching for his hat. He went out to the ladder D that same day, but not to the porch, not to Dunmore. He went where Cora pointed him, around the edge of things, to the livery, and up the loft ladder, and there in the north light coming through the loft door sat Elias Marsh on his bunk, with the sketchbook open on his knee, drawing the way he'd drawn every day of his life, and Nathaniel Crane stood at the top of the ladder and could not, for a moment, speak at all. 2 years. 2 years of letters and plates, and a fame the man never came to claim, and it all came down to this. A quiet fellow in a hayloft 40-odd, plain as fence wire, with lamp black on his fingers and a book bound in saddle string, looking up at him with mild eyes as if strangers climbed his ladder every day of the week. You're HM, Crane said. It wasn't a question, and it barely made it out of him. You're the running horse. Elias looked at him. He looked at the good coat and the New York boots and the magazine that Crane, without even thinking, had pulled halfway out of his bag, the current issue, the running horse stamped on the cover. And something in Elias's face eased, just slightly, the way a man's face eases when a thing he'd carried alone for a long time is suddenly, unexpectedly shared. Crane sat down on an upturned crate in the hay, uninvited, because his legs would not hold him for the wonder of it, and he began to talk, and the talk turned into the thing the ranch never saw. The account. The ledger. $55, Crane said. That's what the weekly paid for a full-page plate, and it had paid it faithfully, plate after plate, 2 years running. He'd sent the money to the Cordell Flats post box, and it had gone out of his hands and into a silence. Do you know, Crane said, leaning forward, do you have any idea what you've been paid? And he told him. Near $2,800 posted by mail over 2 years for the frontier plates of the artist called HM. $2,800. I need you to sit with that number the way the ranch never got to. Because at the ladder D a top hand made maybe $30, $40 a month and thought himself well fixed. Boyd Hatch, the foreman, the great man of that little world, did not clear $400 in a year. And here in the loft, on the bunk, the drifter they docked for daydreaming, the man Dunmore was throwing off the land come autumn, had quietly earned near 7 years of a foreman's wages and had barely touched it. Lived on beans and a loft bunk and a debt at the general store, by choice, purely by choice, because the money was never the thing. The West was the thing. The looking was the thing. The money just piled up in a bank drawer somewhere back east like snow nobody swept. Crane could not fathom it. You could see him trying and failing. He kept saying it, a man of your gifts, living like, and gesturing at the hay, the loft, the plane of it, and Elias just let him say it. Because there was no explaining to a man like Crane that Elias had exactly the life he wanted, and the only thing he'd ever lacked was to be left alone to draw it. But Crane had not come 2,000 miles to give a man his own history. He'd come with an offer, and now, sitting on a crate in a hayloft, he made it. He was planning a special issue, a whole number of the weekly given over to the frontier, the real frontier, the biggest thing the magazine had ever attempted, and he wanted it built entirely on H.M. plates. He wanted 12 new ones. The branding season, the whole cycle of it, drawn on the record by the one hand in America that could do it true. 12 plates. And for the 12, Crane said, and here he named the figure that would have stopped every heart at the Ladder D supper table cold. For the 12, $1,600. 30 days to do them. $1,600. 30 days. Now, here is the moment, the exact middle of the whole story, and I want you to watch what Elias Marsh does with it, because it tells you everything about why the ending lands the way it lands. He did not gasp. He did not bargain. He did not run down the ladder to throw the number in Cyrus Dunmore's face, which, Lord knows, he had earned the right to do. He did not say a single word about the trough, or the torn corner, or 2 years of being served last and blamed first, and docked for looking at the world. Elias Marsh reached over, and he turned the sketchbook to a fresh page, and he picked up his pencil. And he began, right there, with Crane still talking, to draw. That was his yes. That was the whole of it. No speech, no plan, no triumph. The deed was the drawing, and the drawing was the deed. He would make the 12 plates because making pictures of the West was what he did with his hands and his hours and his one short life, and a man had finally come and offered to pay him properly for it, and that was fine. That was good. But he'd have drawn them anyway. He told no one on the ranch. Not Boyd. Not Dunmore. Not a soul at the long table who'd laughed him into the dark. He simply opened his book and set the pencil down and started the first of the 12. Down in the yard, the branding fire still burned. The iron still glowed. Boyd Hatch was still Boyd Hatch, and Cyrus Dunmore was still up on his porch, counting cattle and calling it the measure of a man. And neither of them knew that a New York editor was sitting in their hayloft, or that the drifter they'd condemned had just been offered a fortune to immortalize the very ranch that was casting him out. And they were about to spend the next weeks assuming that stranger in the fine coat had come to buy their water and their land. They had no idea what he'd really come to buy. But you do. You've known all along. For 30 days, the whole town of Cordell Flats got the story exactly backward, and there is something almost funny in it if you have the stomach for that kind of funny. Nathaniel Crane took a room at the Prairie House, the only lodging in town worth the name, and he paid for it a week at a time in Eastern bills that the clerk had to hold up to the window. A man in a fine gray coat, soft hands, a New York way of talking. Word travels in a place that size before the man's bag hits the floor. By supper, the whole flats knew a stranger had come, and by the next morning they had decided what he was. A landman. A waterman. Somebody sniffing after the deed to something. That was the only kind of stranger Cordell Flats had ever known. The railroad had sent men like that. So had the syndicates back east that bought up whole valleys sight unseen. A soft-handed fellow with money and questions was always after the ground, because in that country, the ground was the only thing anybody thought worth having. So they fit Crane into the shape they already knew. And the shape they picked pointed straight at the Ladder D, because Cyrus Dunmore held the best water in the county, and everybody knew it, and Dunmore knew it loudest of all. Crane did nothing to correct them. He couldn't. What was he going to say? That he'd come 2,000 miles to buy pictures from a ranch hand? They'd have laughed him back onto the stage. So he let them think what they thought, and he walked out to the Ladder D more than once in that gray coat, and he stood at the edge of the yard with his hands behind his back, looking at the corrals, looking at the branding fire, looking, though nobody guessed it, at the exact things Elias had already put on paper for 500,000 strangers. And Dunmore watched him look, and Dunmore's chest swelled. Because to Cyrus Dunmore, there was only one reason a rich man from New York would stand at the edge of your yard and study your land that way. He'd come to want it. He'd come to see the size of what Dunmore had built, and to understand, finally, the way the county understood, that Cyrus Dunmore was the biggest name in that stretch of Wyoming. The Baron took to walking out on his porch when Crane was about, thumbs in his vest, letting the man drink in the spread. He had one of the hands run the horses so the stranger could see the stock. He was selling. He thought he was selling. He was standing on his own porch showing off the very ranch that another man had already made famous to the one person on earth who knew it. Now Elias, through all of this, drew. He drew the way a man breathes, which is to say without deciding to, and he drew the 12. He did it in the loft mostly, by the light that came through the gap in the boards at the east end, in the hour before the outfits stirred, and the hour after they turned in. He drew the branding, the smoke of it, the way a calf's eye rolled white, the way Pettis leaned his whole weight into a rope and never knew he'd been made permanent. He drew the storm that came through on the 9th day, the light going green and low, the whole herd turning its tail to the wind at once, like a single animal deciding. He drew Cora Belle at her counter, with her hands flat on the wood, though she was 2 miles off, and he did it from memory. Because he had that face by heart. He told no one. Not one soul on the ladder D knew that the man they'd given his notice was, night after night, setting their whole season down on the record. He didn't do it to spite them. That's the part the men would never understand, even after. He wasn't drawing them to win. He was drawing them because it was true, and true things were what he made pictures of, and whether the true thing had mocked him or fed him made no difference at all to the pencil. Boyd Hatch's face went into that sketchbook drawn with more dignity than Boyd Hatch had ever earned, and Elias never once thought of it as mercy. It was just the face. He drew what was there. But a secret that size does not sit quiet in a small place. It leans against the walls. And twice in those 30 days it very nearly came through. The first time, it was Boyd. Boyd Hatch could not let a thing go, and Elias's new habits had gotten under his skin. The drifter was up before the roosters and out after dark. He'd been seen walking the road to town on a Sunday, which Boyd took as sneaking. And there was the matter of the stranger, the whole ranch buzzing about the landman in the gray coat, and Boyd, who liked to know everything first, had noticed that the stranger's eyes went to the loft more than they went to the water tank. That itched him. He couldn't have told you why, but a foreman whose whole self is built on knowing which men matter cannot stand a mystery growing in his own bunkhouse. So one evening he followed Elias into the barn, and he braced him. "What is it you're always writing in that book?" Boyd said. Not a question. He had his thumbs in his belt and 2 hands loafing behind him for an audience. "You keeping accounts on somebody? You writing letters to that Eastern fellow? Hand it here. I want to see it." And Elias, this is the thing, this is the man. Elias just stood there with the sketchbook against his side and said nothing. Which to Boyd read as guilt. Boyd stepped in and got a hand on the saddle string binding and pulled, and for 1 second the whole story hung on whether Boyd Hatch would open that book. If he'd turned 3 pages, he'd have seen the printed neatness of a hand that had been paid to draw. He'd have seen his own likeness. He'd have started to understand. The truth was an inch from his fingers. And then a rider put his head in the barn door and hollered that a heifer was down in the north cut and Boyd was wanted. Now, Boyd let go of the book to turn his head. Habit. A foreman answers a down animal before he answers his own curiosity, because the animal is money and the curiosity is only itch. He shoved Elias in the shoulder, said this ain't done, and went. And it was done. He never got that close again. The book stayed shut, and the secret stayed in it, and Boyd Hatch walked out to a heifer never knowing he had just had the answer in his fist. The second time it was gentler, and it was Cora. She was frightened the whole month, in the best way a decent person can be frightened. She knew. Crane had come into her store that first day and stood in front of the pinned plate behind her counter, the one of the rider in the storm, the one the drummer had paid a whole silver dollar for, the one she couldn't bear to sell, and he'd gone pale and quiet and asked her, in a voice gone careful, who drew it and where the man was. And Cora, who trusted nobody with money and everybody with kindness, had sized up his face for a long minute and then told him. The latter D asked for Elias Marsh. And she'd worried over it every day since, because she'd handed a stranger the location of the gentlest man she knew, and she didn't yet know if she'd done him a wonder or a harm. So she guarded it. When a bunkhouse hand came in for tobacco and squinted at the pinned plate and said, "Hey, that looks like our corral. That looks like the ladder D fire," Cora Bell put her whole soul into looking bored. "Everything out here looks like everything," she said, and slid his tobacco across, and the hand thought about it for exactly as long as it took to light up. And then he said the fatal thing, the thing that saved the secret. "Nah. Couldn't be. Who'd draw us?" And he laughed at himself and walked out. Who'd draw us? The idea was too big to hold. The men had spent 2 years teaching themselves that Elias was nothing, and a nothing cannot be a somebody, so the evidence bounced off them like hail off a roof. You see how it works. The secret was safe, not because it was hidden well, but because nobody would let themselves believe it. That's the truest kind of hiding there is. And that would have carried them all the way to the finish. 12 plates, 30 days, a quiet man packing his book and drifting off to the next thing with $1,600 in his coat and nobody the wiser. It nearly did. It was Dunmore who broke it. Of course it was. On the 26th day or thereabouts, the Baron's patience with the gray coat ran out. Because Crane, you understand, had never once made him an offer. Dunmore had strutted his stock and shown his water and stood on his porch like a lord for the better part of a month, and the Eastern man had never named a price, never asked to see the deed, never done a single thing a land buyer does. He just kept coming out, and he kept looking, and, Dunmore finally noticed, his looking kept landing on that loft and on that drifter. And a suspicious man, when the flattery he expected doesn't come, curdles fast. Dunmore got it into his head that something was being done to him, that the stranger and the drifter were in some scheme together. Maybe the loft man was a squatter drawing up a claim. Maybe he was mapping the ranch for the Eastern money, marking the water, and the whole soft-handed act was a front. The one thing Cyrus Dunmore could not imagine, could not physically make his mind form, was the truth, that the valuable thing on his ranch was not his land, not his water, not his cattle, but the silent man in his loft and the pictures in that battered book. So he did what men like him do when they cannot understand a thing. He decided to be rid of it. He called Boyd up to the porch on the evening of the 29th day, with the light going gold across the yard, and he said it loud enough for the hands near the corral to hear, because a baron's power is only worth what's witnessed. "That drifter," Dunmore said. "Marsh, I've had enough of him and his book and his skulking, and I don't like this magazine man circling my loft. I don't know what the two of 'em are cooking, and I don't aim to find out. Run him off. Tomorrow morning, first light, him and every scrap of paper he owns. I want him and that Eastern fellow both to understand this is my ground." He tapped the porch rail with one thick finger. A man who decorates instead of works, I told him he was gone by autumn. Autumn came early. Boyd Hatch smiled at that. He'd been waiting 2 years for that smile. And so the thing was set. At first light, on the morning of the 30th day, 1 plate short, 1 single plate short of the 12, Elias Marsh was to be thrown off the ladder D as a vagrant, his sketchbook and all, and sent to the road with nothing, in front of the whole outfit, the way it had all begun. The record of the season, the commission, the man's place in the world, all of it about to go into the dust of that yard. Except that Cora Belle heard of it that same night, because a rancher's loud orders traveled to town on the first horse, and Cora sent a boy running to the prairie house with a folded note. And Nathaniel Crane read it by lamplight, and Nathaniel Crane did not sleep. He sat up in that hard chair with the current issue of Haringate's Illustrated Weekly on his knee, the one with the running horse stamped on the cover. And he waited for the dark to gray. Now, here is the morning. Take it slow, because this is the one that pays for all the rest. First light at the ladder D. The whole outfit turned out, because Dunmore had wanted witnesses, and Boyd had made sure of it. 40-odd men, near 20 hands, and the extra hay crew, all ranged in a loose crowd across the yard, with the branding pen behind them cold and gray. Elias came down the loft ladder with his war bag over one shoulder and the sketchbook under his arm, held in that same close way he always held it. And he did not look angry, and he did not look afraid. He looked the way he always looked, like a man watching weather he'd seen before. Boyd Hatch met him at the bottom of the ladder, thumbs in his belt, grinning. "Told you," Boyd said. "Told you a pencil don't earn a bunk. Off you go, drawing man. Go decorate the road." Dunmore stood up on his porch above them all, thumbs in his vest, ready to say the words that would make it official and make him, one more time, the biggest man in the county. And that is exactly when the gate creaked, and Nathaniel Crane walked into the yard in his gray coat, carrying a magazine in his two hands like a man carrying something in from the cold. The crowd turned. Dunmore's mouth was already open for his speech, and it stayed open. Empty. Because this was not in the plan. The Eastern man was supposed to be back at the prairie house. Instead, here he came, straight across the packed dirt to the porch steps, and he did not ask permission, and he did not slow down. He set the magazine flat on the porch table beside the water pitcher, and he opened it, and he pressed it flat with the heel of his hand. "Before you say a word, Miss Dunmore," Crane said, "I would like every man here to see this," and he stepped back so they could. Nobody moved for a second. Then the nearest hands leaned in, and the ones behind pushed to see, and the whole crowd sort of folded toward the porch. What was on the open page was a picture. A big one, filling the whole front of the magazine, the place of honor, printed clean and dark on good paper. It was the branding fire. Their branding fire. The ladder D corral, drawn from the low angle a man would have if he were sitting on an upturned bucket. The smoke going up in a slow twist. A calf with its eye rolled white. And the men, their own men, Pettis leaning his weight into a rope, another hand wiping his face with his sleeve. The whole hot, crowded business of the season set down so true that a hand named Willis said out loud, without meaning to, "That's me. That's my hat." A sound went through the crowd. Not a word. Just the sound 40 men make when the ground moves. "This is the current issue of Haringate's Illustrated Weekly," Crane said, and his editor's voice carried flat and clear across the yard. "It is printed in New York. It sells better than 500,000 copies. That means 500,000 people, from Boston down to Baltimore and out to Chicago, have opened their week to the sight of your ranch. This ranch. This fire. These men." He let that sit. Every plate that magazine has run from the Wyoming Territory for 2 years, the ones that built our circulation, the ones people buy the paper to see, was drawn by the same hand. Signed the same way. Not with a name. With this. And he reached down and put one finger on the bottom corner of the page, on a mark so small most of them had never noticed it. A tiny running horse, mid-stride. The way it sat in the corner of every page Elias Marsh had ever touched. 500,000 people back east have seen your ranch, Mr. Dunmore, Nathaniel Crane said, and he lifted his eyes to the porch. Not one of them has heard your name. They know his mark. He turned and looked at Elias then. So did every man in the yard. Elias Marsh stood by the loft ladder with his war bag on his shoulder, the same as a minute before. The only change in him was that he had gone very still, the way a man goes still when a thing he has kept quiet for a long time is finally spoken by someone else, out loud, in the light. Now watch what happens to each of them. This is the part you came for, and I won't rush it. Crane wasn't finished. He turned back to the porch, and he laid the numbers down, one at a time, in that same flat voice, and the numbers did what the picture had started. $55 a plate, he said. That is what my magazine has paid this man for every full-page scene, mailed to a box in Cordell Flats, for 2 years. It comes to near $2,800, Mr. Dunmore, already paid. Already earned. A murmur ran the yard. $2,800 was near 7 years of a top foreman's wages, and Boyd Hatch's own face heard the number and went strange. And 9 days ago, I offered him $1,600 more for 12 new plates to run a special frontier issue. He has finished 11. Crane paused. Your order this morning was about to run the most valuable man in this county off into the dust 1 plate short, a man strangers 2,000 miles away pay real money to see the world through. You were about to throw away the only thing on this ranch that anyone outside this county will remember in 50 years. Then, he stopped, and the yard was so quiet you could hear the cold branding iron tick as the morning warmed it. Boyd Hatch was the first face to break, and it broke inward. He was standing 3 feet from Elias, and his grin was gone, and he was looking at the open magazine on the porch table, at the page, and his eyes had found the thing his mind couldn't get away from. His own face was in that picture. Down in the crowd of drawn men, near the fire, was Boyd Hatch, rope in hand, and the drifter he had tormented for 2 years had drawn him, with more dignity than Boyd had ever once shown another living soul. Straight-backed. Strong, a man at good work. It was not a cruel drawing. It would have been so easy for it to be a cruel drawing. And it wasn't. And that was the thing Boyd could not bear. He had held that book over a horse trough. He had torn a corner of it in the bunkhouse for a laugh, and the man he'd done it to had turned around and made him look like something worth being. Boyd opened his mouth. Nothing came. What was there to say? He looked at Elias, and he could not hold it, and he looked at the ground, and he took 1 step back, and that was all. He said not a single word the whole rest of that morning, and his silence was the sentence he handed himself, heavier than anything the crowd could have thrown at him. A loud man gone quiet in front of 40 witnesses. Everyone saw it. Nobody had to name it. Up on the porch, Cyrus Dunmore was doing the hardest arithmetic of his life. You have to understand what broke in him, because it wasn't the money, though the money was real. It was the other thing. Dunmore had spent his whole life measuring men one way, by cattle, by land, by the size of the brand, and the reach of the water. That was the only ruler he owned. And he was standing there looking at his ranch, his fire, his men, made permanent and made famous, carried into 500,000 homes he would never see, and none of it carried his name. It carried a running horse drawn by a hand he'd called idle. His cattle would be sold and eaten and forgotten. His land would pass to somebody. But this picture, this thing the drifter made, this was going to outlive him. He was going to be remembered, if he was remembered at all, as a shape in the corner of another man's work. A baron who'd spent 40 years making his name the biggest thing in the county had just learned his name didn't leave the county, and the silent man he was running off that morning had reached farther in 2 quiet years than Dunmore had reached in his whole loud life. He came down the porch steps, slow. He was not a man who knew how to bend, and it showed in every joint. He stopped in front of Elias, and he cleared his throat, and he said, stiff as a fence post, "The loft's yours as long as you want it, Marsh, no charge. And theirs, hands wages if you'll stay on. Draw whatever you please." He couldn't quite look at him. Should have, and he stopped, because should have looked closer was 3 words too honest for Cyrus Dunmore to say in front of his men, and so he just let it hang, unfinished, in the cold morning air. "Too late" was written all over his face. Everybody in the yard could read it. The offer was real, and it was decent in its clumsy way, and it had come about 10 minutes and 2 years past when it might have meant anything. And Elias Marsh, for the first time that morning, spoke. He didn't gloat. That's not in him. You've watched it all along, and it wasn't going to arrive now just because he'd finally won. He looked at Dunmore, and he said, quiet, in that voice the ranch had heard maybe 10 words of a day, "I'll finish the 12th here. Then I'll see." That was all. No speech about the trough. No throwing the $2,800 in the Baron's teeth. He'd earned the right to burn the man down to the ground with words, and he simply declined to pick the words up. He had never defended himself against them, not once, in 2 years. And he wasn't going to start by attacking them now that he didn't have to. The mark did his talking. It always had. The outfit stood quiet. 20-odd men who had laughed at the supper, who had passed the book around the bunkhouse and torn its corner, who had watched him served last and blamed first, and had thought it all just fine. They stood in that yard now and could not find anywhere to put their eyes. Nobody laughed. Nobody so much as grinned. It's a strange thing to watch a crowd understand, all at once, that they've been on the wrong side of a man the whole time, and that he's not going to make them pay for it, which somehow makes it worse and better both. And then the oldest hand on the place, a bandy-legged man named Willis, the one who'd said "That's my hat," took off that same hat and turned it in his hands and came a few steps forward and said the thing that broke the morning open into something gentler than revenge. "Mr. Marsh," Willis said. And there was a Mr. on it now that had never been there before. "My boy's 12. He's back at the home place in Nebraska with his mother. I ain't got no picture of him, and I ain't never gonna afford one." He turned the hat. "If I described him to you, if I told you his face, could you? Would you draw him? I'd pay what I could." And there it was. Not one of them wanted to hurt Elias back. Not one wanted to see Dunmore or Boyd dragged. What they wanted, the second they understood what he could do, was for him to do it for them. For their sons. That's the whole measure of the man's gift right there. Humiliated people ask for revenge, and these men, faced with the one who could have had it, asked instead for a picture of a boy in Nebraska. Elias looked at old Willis for a long moment, and then he did the only thing he ever did when he meant yes. He set his war bag down in the dirt. He sat down on the edge of the porch step, right there in the middle of that whole assembled outfit that had come to watch him thrown out. He opened the sketchbook to a fresh page. And he said, "Tell me his face." And he began to draw. That autumn the special Frontier issue printed, and it went out across the country the way the others had, only bigger, because Crane put every one of the 12 plates in it and put the running horse artist's story alongside them for the first time. 500,000 copies, then more when it sold out, and they ran it again. For the first time in its life, the town of Cordell Flats, Wyoming Territory, appeared by name in the East, printed under one of the pictures, and it appeared there because Elias Marsh asked. As the one condition of the whole business, that Crane captioned the plate of the general store with the town's real name and the words bells, Cordell Flats. He wanted the place named. He wanted her place named. Elias stayed. But not the Baron's way, and not in the Baron's loft. He took the small, clean room over Cora Bell's store, the one with a window that faced north, because north light is the light that doesn't change on you through the day, and a man drawing needs light he can trust. He put a table under that window and a new sketchbook on the table. Mornings you could look up and see him there, coffee going cold at his elbow because he'd forgotten it again. The pencil moving. He had $1,600 and near $2,800 behind it, and he lived exactly the way he'd always lived. plain, because the plainness had never been poverty. It had been choice. The West was still out the window and he was still drawing it, and now the world knew his hand, and it changed almost nothing about the hand. Crane kept his word about which plate ran first in that special issue. Elias had drawn 12, and any of the 12 could have led, the storm, the fire, the herd turning as one. But the plate Crane put at the frontispiece of the whole frontier issue, was the one of Cora Bell at her counter. Hands flat on the wood. That patient, decent face, a widow who'd traded a quiet man paper and pencils on credit for 2 years and kept every scrap he ever gave her, and never once, in all that time, knew she was feeding a famous man. She found out the way the whole country found out, by seeing it printed, and 500,000 people, that season, opened their magazine to the face of the woman who'd believed in Elias Marsh before there was one single reason to, back when believing in him cost her $1 worth of pencils and got her nothing but the pleasure of decency. She kept the original of the Storm Rider still pinned behind her counter, the way she always had. A man offered her real money for it, that autumn, now that the name was known. She said no. It had never been for sale. It wasn't going to start being for sale just because the world caught up to what she'd known all along. As for the two of them, Cyrus Dunmore framed that frontispiece, the branding fire, his ranch, his men, and hung it in the parlor of the big house, in the best light he had. And it is a true thing, and a dry one, that for the rest of his years, the visitors who came and stood in front of it always asked the same question, and it was never whose ranch is this. It was who drew this. Every time. The Baron built 40 years of cattle and land to make his name the biggest thing in the county, and he ended up the owner of a famous picture that made strangers ask after another man. He'd wanted to be the measure of every man who worked for him. He got to be the frame around one of them. And Boyd Hatch. There isn't much to say about Boyd, and that's the point. He stayed on as foreman, because a ranch needs a foreman, and he was good with cattle if nothing else. But something had gone out of the loud part of him that morning, in the yard, and it never came back. And the men noticed, in the small way men notice such things, that Boyd Hatch never again reached for another man's book. Not a Bible, not a ledger, not a boy's dime novel left on a bunk. If a thing was another man's, and it was written or drawn in, Boyd let it lie. He never explained it. He didn't have to. He'd learned, one cold morning, exactly what can be inside a book you thought was nothing, and the lesson had taken all the way down. The West was full of loud men that year. It was full of Dunmores counting cattle and Boyd's mistaking cruelty for strength, men certain that the measure of a person was the size of the noise he made. And the country doesn't remember many of them. What it remembered, what got carried 2,000 miles into parlors that had never smelled sage or seen a branding fire, was made by the quietest man in the outfit, the one who wouldn't defend himself, who'd rather vanish than argue, who sat on an upturned bucket and got kicked and just kept drawing. The West didn't need a louder man. It had plenty. It needed one who kept looking, at the true thing, long after everyone told him to quit. And it got him, in a livery loft, signing his whole enormous life with a mark the size of a thumbnail, a small running horse, mid-stride, drying in the north light on a fresh page. So the next time somebody looks past you, the next time a Boyd or a Dunmore decides they've got you measured and finds you wanting, you remember Elias Marsh, and you keep doing the true quiet thing you do. Let the mark talk. It carries farther than the noise ever will. Comment the name of your town below, and I'll draw it into the map of places this story has reached.